give a nice overview of my work, but I thought I'd show you the covers of my last three books, which are really of a different sort than books that I had written earlier in my writing career. As Barb said, I've done a lot of travel writing. I wrote a book called Off the Beaten Path and a guide to Mississippi river towns. I wrote a children's book called Sweet Corn and Sushi that came out in 2004. But about 10 years or so ago, I really focused on two great passions in my life, one travel and one spirituality, and on the intersection between those two. And so Holy Rover, which is on the screen right now, was the first book in that sort of revitalization of my writing career. It's a memoir built around trips to a dozen holy sites around the world. And then a couple years later, I came out with Near the Exit, Travels with a Not So Grim Reaper, which is a book about what places that have taught me about mortality. The book was sparked by losing my 59-year-old brother unexpectedly to a heart attack the same week my mother went into memory care at a nursing home. So it's a reflection on mortality through the lens of travel. And what I always like to tell people about the book is that it's about death, but I hope it's not depressing. I mean, I think it's sort of whimsical and thoughtful, I hope, and it's meant to get people thinking about end of life issues and maybe from a somewhat new perspective. And then The Soul of the Family Tree, which is the book that I'm going to be talking about today. The cover actually says quite a bit about the book. One of the things you learn once you're an author is just how important covers are and how much information that they try to convey. And so if you look at the cover for my book, you'll see it looks very Scandinavian. The style of art is called rose mauling, which I'm sure some of you know, flower painting, rose painting. There's a stylized version of a family tree there that has a DNA helix through the center of it. There are a couple of Viking longboats. And then below my name at the bottom, there are a couple of broadswords, also a nod to my Viking forebears. And so my book is an effort to sort of put a different spin on genealogy. Some of you may recognize the distinctive artwork of another Iowa City creative, Claudia McGehee, contributed several drawings and a map to the book. And I love this image of a woman hanging onto a strand of DNA looking off into the distance, because that's really what my book is about looking into the inner recesses of our genes, as well as back into the past to try to figure out who we are. And so the book tells my story, but it's very much meant to be a book that's an invitation to reflection on the part of readers as well. And I'll be talking more about how I hope that might happen when people read it. I have to show this cartoon is not in my book. Someone sent it to me after it came out, but I just love it. So you can see it's a Viking longboat, warship, and they're all wearing the distinctive Viking hats that actually aren't historically authentic, but everyone always pictures them with them. And the caption says, "It's come to my attention that some of you are cows." And I love this cartoon because it actually sort of relates to one of the themes of my book, which is once you start looking at your ancestors, you realize there are some surprises there, and they may not be the people who you thought were in your family tree. And it also, of course, makes fun of the Vikings. And part of my book is about this very interesting and sometimes problematic group of seafarers. And I'll talk a little bit more about them in just a minute. So my book is a mixture of travelogue, of reflection, of memoir, and history. And different parts of the book touch on those different themes in stronger, lighter ways, depending on what the focus is of the particular chapters. One of the things, though, that I was really delighted to be able to do in this book, maybe that's a bit more than in my previous books, is to deal with history. And I've always had a love for history. And I think anyone who delves into genealogy quickly realizes that in order to understand your family's past, you have to understand the cultural and historic context of your family. And that was fascinating to me, to have an excuse to dive pretty deep into my ancestral roots. And for me, they are strongly Norwegian. I'm a native of Decorah in Northeast Iowa. I'm sure some of you have been there, or even from there, or have connections there. Decorah is probably the most Norwegian American community in the United States. And when I was growing up, I certainly was immersed in a lot of the Norwegian American culture there, but in the way of most young people, I took it for granted and was a little bit, sometimes snarky about it, I would say. But then once I started thinking about writing a book about genealogy, I realized I needed to learn more about that part of my cultural background. And there's my cat, who I'm going to push down. Sorry about that. So Decorah is, of course, home to many Norwegian Americans. It's home to Vesterheim, which is the National Norwegian American Museum. And it's a good place. It was a good place to start this leap backwards, farther into time, to look at the Viking Age. When I was thinking of writing my book, one of the ways in which I hoped to broaden its appeal was to spend quite a bit of time in my book talking about the Vikings, because they have a kind of cachet in popular culture that I think is pretty unusual. You know, there are a lot of ancient cultures that we don't think that much about, the Etruscans or the Sumerians or whatever, but the Vikings hold a fascination that is exhibited in movies and films and books and popular culture in all sorts of ways. We also have a lot of cultural legacies from the Vikings. Many words in English can be traced back to Old Norse, which was the language spoken by the Vikings. Several of our days of the week are actually Scandinavian in origin. Wednesday is named after Woden, which is the old Saxon form of Odin, who was the leader of the Norse pantheon of gods. Thursday, Thor's Day. Friday, Frigg's Day. These were gods, of course, Thor and Frigg. In our phones, if you have a smartphone, you're carrying a bit of the Vikings with you, because Bluetooth, which is technology used to unite your phone with different pieces of technology, is actually named after Harold Bluetooth, who was a Viking Age chieftain. And the symbol for Bluetooth is a stylized B, a slash marks with very angular letter. And those are actually Viking runes. And the Danish company that developed the technology for Bluetooth wanted to give it a name that reflected their Scandinavian heritage and also related to what Bluetooth did. And so Harold Bluetooth united warring Viking tribes. Bluetooth unites different types of technology. And so that's why we all have Bluetooth, and we carry a bit of the Vikings with us. So this picture is a stained glass window that's from the Jorvik Viking Center in York, England, one of the places I visited to do research. One of the things about the Vikings is that they didn't stay home all the time. And there were Viking settlements throughout Northern Europe. In many places, they blended into the local population and became English or Spanish or French. But that distinctive Norse culture still had a lot of influence in a lot of different places. This is a map that was created by Claudia McGeehee for my book. It sort of orients people. You can see Scandinavia, Greenland, Canada over on the left, Newfoundland, which is the site of a Viking colony that was founded by Leif Erickson, who plays an important role in my book because one of the things that I have always said about myself from the time I was small is that I'm a direct descendant of Leif Erickson. And I made that claim on the basis of our shared Norwegian ancestry and the fact that our names sound alike. Leif Erickson, Lori Erickson, both love to travel. How could we not be related? And also, I wasn't related to anyone else famous, and you sort of go with what you have. So in researching my book, I knew I wanted to delve into the history of Leif Erickson, who was the first North American to found a colony in the New World in around the year 1000. And so one of the trips I made in the book, which I describe, is to go to Lanza Meadows, Canada, which is on the very, very eastern tip of North America. And it is the place where, and I'll go back just one here. The description of that colony comes from the Icelandic Sagas, two of them in particular, that were written down in about the 13th century. The Icelandic Sagas are tales that were written down by Christian scribes talking about the exploits of their pagan ancestors from a couple of hundred years before. There are many of them. They are really wonderful pieces of literature. They're sometimes called the precursors of the modern novel, in fact, because they have such vivid characters and speeches and shifting dynamics and tales of revenge and heroism and doomed love affairs. And they're really marvelous stories. And the stories of the colony in North America are the Vinland stories, and they're included in two different sagas. One, the saga of Eric the Red, who was Leif Ericsson's father, and the other one was the and now I'm blanking on that. The Vinland Chronicles. I think that's it. And so the story is told in those two sagas, and for a long time, those sagas were thought to be largely fictional until in the early 1960s, there was a Norwegian explorer and adventurer who discovered the actual remains of the Viking site at Lanza Meadows in Canada. This is a reconstruction of one of the longhouses that was constructed by the Vikings during about a 10-year period around the year 1000. I think it's interesting that about a month or so ago, there was a piece of news from Lanza Meadows in Canada that made worldwide media a mention. And that's that archaeologists there had been able to pinpoint to the exact year when a particular implement had been created in this Viking settlement. And even though a lot had been known about the settlement before, it was the first time that an exact date had been given to an artifact from there. And I think it was interesting, the attention that was poured upon this somewhat obscure discovery. I think it's an indication of the fascination that a lot of people have for the Viking Age. So I went to Canada. I met a couple of reenactors there who portray members of the colony that lived there for about a 10-year period. Here's a replica of the type of boat that Leif Erickson and his crew probably used to sail to the New World. It's not a classic Viking longboat warship, with the dragon heads at either end. This was known as a knar. It was more of a sturdy workhorse of a boat, a broader, less, not as fast or maneuverable, but it was good for carrying cargo, and so that's likely what they used when they came to Canada. There was another person who I discovered in the research for my book, who actually in the end became more important to me than Leif Erickson, and that's his sister-in-law, Gudrid. This is a statue of her in Iceland, in the western coast of Iceland. Gudrid was a remarkable woman in all sorts of ways. In the Icelandic sagas, she actually gets more attention than Leif Erickson does. She was a woman who straddled the New World and the Old World, paganism and Christianity, with remarkable grace. She was probably the most well-traveled woman of the Middle Ages. She was part of the second expedition that came to the New World, gave birth to the first child of European descent in North America, and lived there for about 3 years. And then after the colony failed, went back to Iceland, well, first to Greenland and then to Iceland. She raised 2 sons, was left a widow, and then went on pilgrimage to Rome. She had become a Christian by this time, and she most likely sailed to Denmark and then walked all the way across mainland Europe to Rome, which was a remarkable journey for a woman to take around the year 1000. And then she walked back to Denmark and then took a boat back to Iceland and lived out the rest of her days in Iceland, where she was renowned for her wisdom and her good humor and her kindness. And she's known as Gudrid the Far Traveler. And many people in Iceland to this day claim descent from Gudrid the Far Traveler. And as soon as I learned about her story, I decided I wanted to have her as my foremother. And so I claimed her. And that actually relates to one of the themes of my book, which is looking at genealogy in a different sort of way, really playing with imagination and playing with metaphor and with ways of opening up the past in new ways in order to make connections to it. Let me tell you, I'm going to go through some of the pictures that are in my book. All of these images are in my book. At the beginning of each chapter, there's a photograph or a drawing in this case. This is a picture of from Norse mythology of the 3 Norns, Norns. The Norns were 3 supernatural beings who were said to control the destiny, the fate of both the gods and humans. Somewhat similar to the fates in Greek mythology. I also decided that one of the best ways to get in touch with my ancestors was to try to live like a Viking for a time. So I went to a Viking festival in Moorhead, Minnesota. Got the chance to dress up like a Viking woman. It was just for a weekend, and I did stay in a hotel overnight rather than sleep in a tent. But it was a wonderful way of experiencing in sort of a visceral way what it might have been like to live as a Viking. And it's one of the suggestions I have for people who are interested into learning more about their family past is to seek out a reenactment from whatever branch of the human family is of interest to you or whatever period. It's really a wonderful experiential way to get a sense for what it was like to live in the past. And so these were 2 people who were there. I love the fact that the little guy is learning how to be a Viking, learning about his Scandinavian heritage from the time he was very small. I also did more traditional genealogy. The second half of the book really focuses on my search for my Norwegian American immigrant roots. And in particular, I focused on one set of great-great-grandparents, Hans and Silla, who emigrated from the fjord region of Norway in 1850. These are not my particular relatives. This is actually a picture done by Knut Knutsen, who was one of the first professional photographers in Norway. And I use it as sort of representative of an entire era of immigrants who made that great leap across the Atlantic to start over in America. And I also tell a bit more about Carl Knutsen's story in my book too. So he's part of the tale as well. So, one more thing about this. As part of the research for the book, I went to the Norwegian American Genealogical Center in Madison, Wisconsin, and had some help in tracing the story of my great-great-grandparents. And what I tried to do throughout the memoir portion of my book is to tell my story in a way that I hope that people can really find a lot of entry points with their story. Because I hope my book will be of interest not just to those who are of Scandinavian ancestry, but rather to anyone who's ever maybe done a DNA test and looked at the results and thought, well, what do I do with that? Or where do I go from here? And so a genealogical center can really be a great help. Certainly, Salt Lake City and the resources that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons Church, they have been enormously helpful to people who are tracing their family roots and offer a lot of free help in a way that's a tremendous service to people. So there's a lot of help out there if you need to know where to go next in your search. Another chapter in my book is called The Perils of Myth Making. And this picture is of, it's called the Kensington Runestone. Runes are the Viking writing, the angular writing that you can see incised on the stone there. It was a famous 19th century hoax, almost certainly a hoax. This stone was dug up in a field by a Swedish immigrant farmer in about 1890. And it was thought for many decades that it was carved by actual Vikings in about the year 1300, and that it tells a story of Vikings wandering around in Minnesota and of a battle that they had, and of a number of them died, and the stone was to mark the spot. For a long time, that story was thought to be true. It later was discovered that this was almost certainly a hoax, which was evaluation made on the basis of a complicated linguistic analysis of the runes. It's a fake, but it's a really good fake. I used the story of the Kensington Runestone to bring up the idea of all the ways in which myths are part of families as well. And they're part of our cultural tradition as well. And sometimes they're positive and sometimes they're negative. A story like the Kensington Runestone is largely harmless, but I also bring up the most infamous myth connected to Scandinavian history, and that's the Aryan race myth that Hitler and the Nazis forged, which had tremendously negative consequences, of course. They took some of the seeds of the myths of the North and then twisted them to their own ends. And so I talk about the dangers of myth making, but then also the ways in which families and cultures need myths. There are ways of conveying truths through stories that often cannot be easily conveyed otherwise. And so it's one of the chapters that I hope will get people thinking about the ways in which their family maybe has myths and stories that pass along lessons and maybe sometimes have some not so positive associations as well. I also went to Norway, of course. How can you write a book about being a Norwegian American on a genealogical quest, and not go to Norway? One of the wonderful happy coincidences that I discovered in writing my book was that Hans and Silla, my great-grandparents, who I had chosen somewhat at random on my family tree, both of them turned out to have been baptized in probably the most beautiful historic church in Norway. This is the Borgand Church, which is in the fjord region of Western Norway. It's one of the best preserved medieval churches in Scandinavia. And as you can see, it's very dramatic looking. It's got dragon heads that are leaping off the roof. It's a style of architecture that very much was on the cusp between the shift from the pagan world to the Christian world. And there are a lot of elements of traditional pagan architecture in there, probably pagan temples had elements that were maybe similar to this. It's an odd building when you go inside because there are no upper floors. There's just gathering for worshipers on the lower level, and it's a pretty small space there. But when you look up, there's this great echoing, dark, mysterious space. It's almost like you're standing inside this ancient tree. the wood has this patina of age, and there's this smell of old timbers in there, and there's very little light because there's hardly any windows in it. So it really does feel like you're in a pagan temple almost. And it was just a wonderful, happy discovery to realize that I have a tie to this incredibly beautiful, powerful, mysterious, holy site. The last chapter of the book is about Saint Olaf, who is the patron saint of Norway. And the chapter is a chance to really focus on the spiritual traditions of my heritage. As I said earlier, I have a long-standing interest in the ways in which travel and spirituality fit together, and the ways in which spirituality reveals characteristics about place and about people. And so the story of Saint Olaf, I won't go into detail, but he was not one of your sort of meek and pious and well-behaved saints. In fact, he was probably the only saint in the Christian canon who killed another saint, though it did happen before he was canonized. But he was on a raiding party when he was still a Viking, and he was part of a group that killed the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time in England. But in later years, Saint Olaf had sort of a makeover and became a fine, upstanding Christian king who was a model of sort of moral rectitude. And his story is really an interesting one to look at in terms of how myths get made and how the stories of the past inspire us. And then there is actually one more part of my book. It's an epilogue, and the epilogue is set in Philadelphia, of all places. But I went to Philadelphia to see this particular boat. This is called the Draken, the dragon, in Old Norse. It's the largest Viking longboat built in the modern era. It was constructed in Norway using historically accurate tools and materials. It was sailing down the East Coast a number of years ago. And when I heard about that, I knew I had to see it. Because though I'd spent a lot of time researching and traveling in Norway and Newfoundland and England, I really hadn't gotten the chance to actually stand on a Viking boat. And these boats were so important to the Vikings and continued to be such an iconic symbol of Scandinavia, even after the Viking Age had passed, that I really wanted to experience being on one. I didn't get the chance to be on it at sea, unfortunately, but I did get the chance to be on board. It was docked in the harbor in Philadelphia. I got the chance to interview the people who were sailing on it, including probably one of the most experienced longboat sailors in the world, someone who spent much of his adult life sailing longboats. I got to interview the people who came to visit this Viking ship and talk to them about why they were interested in the Viking Age. And to me, it was a really fitting place to end my book, to see the ways in which this part of Scandinavian history continues to live in the imaginations of everyone, not just people who have that ethnic piece in their family tree. So I'm just going to show you my website real quickly, and then I'm going to turn off the PowerPoint and talk some more. I encourage you to sign up for my monthly newsletter if you're interested. You can find it on my website. If you just Google Lori Erickson author, you can find it as well. Okay, so I'm going to stop share now, and then hopefully I'm back. And it looks like I am. So I have a few more things to say. What I'd like to do in the remaining time here before I open it up for some questions is to talk about some of the ways in which I hope people will take what I had to say in my book and make it their own. And I'm going to, okay. Okay. Because the central question of my book is, why should you care about my ancestors? Because we all have lots of ancestors. And why should you care about mine? Or also, why should you care about yours? And so my argument is, in many ways, an argument for why it's important to pay attention to your family tree and why genealogy can be a tool for self-discovery. And I come about that in a variety of ways in the book that I wrote. One of the central metaphors that I play around with in my book is something called the web of weird. And the web of weird is a concept that I actually learned from a woman in Minneapolis whose name is Kari Turing, Tauring, who is working to develop a form of spirituality that is deeply informed by pagan Scandinavian traditions, but it's also adapted to the modern world. And so I came across her work on the internet and became really fascinated and ended up traveling to Minnesota to meet her. And then we ended up going to a Viking festival together. So I had a lot of time to pick Kari Turing's brain. And one of her central ideas that she teaches in her classes and her workshops is about the web of weird. So the web of weird, weird spelled W-Y-R-D, comes from the Old Norse term for fate or destiny. That's what weird means. It's a term that in some ways is similar to karma, which is an Indian concept, of course, but the Norse had an idea too, that the past could influence the present and the future. And so the Norse viewed weird somewhat as we view science, in the sense that it was a way of explaining what went on in the world. And even though you might not know the particulars of why something happened, they would have had just a general confidence, well, weird could explain it. Sort of like, I wouldn't know how to send a rocket up to the moon, but I'm confident that if you know enough about science, you could figure it out. And so this concept was, in many ways, the foundational belief of the Viking, of the Old Norse world. So weird became our English word weird, W-E-I-R-D, in a much smaller sort of way. When we say something is weird, we mean it's sort of strange or peculiar, but it's not that big a deal. But for the Vikings, weird would have been the sort of thing that might make the hair stand up on your arms, something that was a brush with a numinous. So the web of weird is this idea that these lines of fate, these threads of connection, go into the past, connect everyone in the present, and go into the future. And that there's almost like an energy that flows along these lines. And that when you're born, those Norns, the goddesses of fate that I showed you a drawing of, that they create the thread that you're going to make your life out of. But that thread you get from your ancestors. And the thread that you receive, the pattern that's been woven, might be sort of frayed and damaged. It might be misshapen in lots of ways. And that during your lifetime, you can, in a sense, re-knit some of that, reweave it, so that when you pass along a portion of the web to your descendants, it's smoother. It's some of those unhealthy patterns are woven together in a better way. And as soon as I heard about that metaphor, I was really taken by it, because I thought it was such a beautiful way of encapsulating a lot of psychological truths that certainly psychology or counselors would tell us, that many of the patterns that we inherit are formed by families, what happened to families in years past, from the past traumas that might have happened 100 years before, but they're still passed down in various ways. And this idea that we don't have to just live with them, we can re-knit them in a way. And so I thought it was a beautiful way of conveying some central truths about families that I think are important. I think another thing that I hope people might take from my book is a chance to reflect and maybe come to peace with the whole idea of badly behaving relatives. So in my case, I talk a lot about the Vikings. I know about the problematic aspects of these warriors of the North who were slave traders. They were conquerors. They stole a lot of gold from places around Europe. But they were also adventurers, merchants, explorers. They were, in short, like all humans, multifaceted and a mixture of good and bad. And so in one of the chapters, the chapter is titled Badly Behaving Relatives, and it deals with this idea of how do we come to terms with the past, with ancestors either far away in the past or more recently who did things that were reprehensible, that were problematic, that were hurtful. How do we make peace with that? And that's not an easy question to answer, of course, and my book only touches upon some of the ways in which people might make use of those ideas. But I think my book in general is sort of a rueful recognition that all of us have badly behaving relatives, and that this mixture of good and bad threads through all of our webs of weird, and that maybe some, a rueful recognition of our own mixture of good and evil, good and bad, is probably a good thing to have as you're looking back, as well as trying to figure out what to do with your own life. I also talk about something called spiritual DNA. And by that, I mean, one of my hesitations about writing a book about genealogy was that I didn't want it to be just about sort of genetics and about the kind of genealogy that's done only because of blood relations, and because I think that's too limited a kind of view on genealogy. For one thing, there are all sorts of people for whom that really doesn't apply. They might be adopted, they might be estranged from their families of origin, their genetic families of origin, but they're still embedded in families. They're still embedded in cultures, and so I try to, in my book, open up the idea of family to talk about cultural cousins, cultural transmission, about the ways in which we're influenced by spiritual ancestors as well. One of the things I do in the book is to construct my spiritual family tree, which in my case includes a lot of cousins on different faiths. So I was raised a Lutheran and continue to be a Christian, but I have a great interest in other faiths, particularly Buddhism, but have been influenced by a lot of different wise people in the past. And so I went ahead and created a family tree that includes those people because they've influenced me. They're part of who I am. And so I encourage people to think about that idea of who's on their spiritual family tree as well. Just a couple of other things that I'll say before I open it up for comments and questions. One of the things I hope people might do after reading my book is to think more carefully about this idea of choosing ancestors, which seems like an oxymoron. How can you choose an ancestor? But my example of Gudrid the Far Traveler, I think, is an example of that. Someone who was in my broader ethnic background, who, when I learned her story, I became really fascinated and spent a lot of time researching who she was and reflecting on about what her life might teach me. And so I encourage people to do that as well. Look at the broader cultural context of where you might come from and think about who your role models might be. And I would encourage people not just to limit it to people from their own particular corner of the ancestral world, that there may be other cultures that you really admire and want to learn about. And, in the broad scope of the human family tree, we're all related. And so you can claim them as kin, even though it might not be a real direct relationship that you have.